This is not truly the first chaos perspective novel. There were several others, including Storm of Iron, which really gave chaos a cool touch, a personal touch. But this is the first one to start the trend where it makes the protagonist, the Chaos Space Marine, whose special power is he's a space marine. He can remember what it was like to be a good guy. And you'll see this kind of character over and over and over again in the next decades to come. But this is the original, Barsabbas. Barsabbas woke from his sleep to an aching in his left primary lung. Abruptly uncomfortable, he sat up and swung his legs over the edge of his cot. Grimacing, he lowered himself slowly. It was not real pain, not real damage, but it seemed real to him nonetheless. Your lung is troubling you again? Barsabbas called out. Sargo appeared in the doorframe, dressed in a body glove for early sparring. The same. I feel it most in the mornings. The Churgeons were not thorough in purging the residual shrapnel. Barsabbas nodded, thoughtfully. He was feeling the old wounds of his blood bond, a common experience between pairs. After all, it had been Barsabbas's left primary lung they had excised and transplanted into Sargo in their ritual of pairing. Years ago, as a young neophyte, Barsabbas had not fully understood the rituals performed upon him. He remembered vaguely the surgical pain, the multiple waking horrors as Churgeons sheared his bones for marrow and operated on his muscles like flaps from a book. There were not many memories from that time, but those were the ones he had recalled. Now, as an older, wiser battle brother, Barsabbas still knew little of the secret bond. The process itself had become blurred with folklore and mysticism, to the point where effect and placebo became one. Paired with the veteran Sargo, Barsabbas would become strengthened by their shared experience. He would inherit not only Sargo's genetic memory, but also his bravery and ferocity. There was an element of witchcraft in this, but whenever Barsabbas felt that twinge in his lung, he was convinced there was substance to the ritual. How is your knee? Sargo asked, flexing his own. Barsabbas stretched out his right leg, the thick cords of his thigh rippling. Better today, he shrugged. I thought so, nodded Sargo, flexing his own right leg. They were ferocious, those Tau. Much better at war making than I had expected. Barsabbas had almost repressed the memory of defeat, but Sargo's words invoked the images back to wakefulness. Just 10 lunar cycles ago, they had deployed on the Tau world designated Gonava, a planet targeted for its lush, natural resources and relatively weak military presence. It should have been a simple plunder raid for Squad Beshpa, hit hard and retreat with mid-grade quota of slaves. But they had underestimated the aliens, and the Tau military presence proved entirely capable. They engaged on the tundra, trading shots between dwarf shrubs and sledges, low grasses and lichens. By the hundreds, the Tau had come, their firing lines disciplined, and their shots overwhelming in sheer volume. Pulsating blue plasma hammered them so hard their armor systems had been pushed to failure, and Barsabbas' suit had reached 70% damage threshold within the first two volleys. The squad had fought with customary aggression and speed. They had burst amongst the Tau infantry squares, plowing through their chest-high adversaries, splintering their helmets and bones. They had killed so many. But it was the Tau's home, and they did not flee. Squad Beshpa had been driven back, overwhelmed by sheer numbers. In the end, they had fled, chased by ground-hugging Tau hoverers. They escaped, but without any dignity, and their wounds were many. Like Barsabbas' disintegrated patella and Sargo's collapsed lung, the shame had stayed with them, agonizing them for the past 10 months. Thousands of slaves woke to the pulsating itch in their left cheekbones, scratching their scarred faces. It was an urgent, pressing discomfort that could not be ignored. Beneath each scar could be seen the outline of a flesh-burrowing thrall worm. Agitated during sleep cycles, When the slaves were distant from their masters, the thrall worms bulged against the cheeks like distended tumors. With clockwork precision, at the 6 hour mark, the parasites would rouse their host by feeding on the rich fat beneath their skins. Sleepy eyed, fatigued, and forlorn, the slaves would wake to their daily work. The workforce were all kinds and pasts, both strong and feeble, soldiers and clerics, shift workers or merchants. Here an artisan, over there a human guard colonel, all of them slaves to the bonded brotherhood. Those strong and young set about the tasks of burden, carrying equipment lockers and hefty pallets. The old and feeble, those who had been branded many years ago, fanned out into the corridors to light the upper halls with sconce lanterns. Others fetched hotches of roast for their twin masters. For although the post-humans did not need such food for sustenance, they enjoyed the taste of rare meat. The most unfortunate of all were those who formed the work teams, the delvers. They were given the impossible duty of clearing the encroaching bioflora that had threatened to overwhelm the ship. Such teams often disappeared into the forgotten sectors of the ship, which had become carnivorous in its ecosystems. Those regions became wildernesses, and the delvers, with their hatches and chain cutters, could do little to stop their spread. Many were lost to the apex predators that flourished in the abyssal depths of the space hulk. Slaves who had become favorites were allowed to rise one ship's cycle later than the rest. The black turban sentries in their hauberks of brass, the gun ratings, the deckhands, and pleasure pets were all among the number who enjoyed relative luxury. But on this day, all the slaves, regardless of their hierarchy, would forego sleep or food, for the blood Gorgons were mobilizing. It was not a full chapter strength deployment, but it would still be a time of solemn ritual and ceremony. The drop chambers would need to be cleaned, and the vacuum locks cleared. Weapons would be oiled and armor polished. Sacrifices would be made. There was much work to be done. Mr. Zhao, or whoever wrote this, I hope it was you, Henry Zhao. I'm just going to be referring to you mostly. It's just world building. You've just been giving us world building this whole time. I think one thing has happened. The rest has been world building, exposition, and it's wonderful. It's wonderful because this world is one. It's a wonderful world. There's something bad about the blood Gorgons, but there's also something good about them. I can't quite describe it. They're not just there for destruction, but they're like they don't just destroy. I guess there's also a certain quality that they possess and they spread, and so that's something cool about them. They're the only chapter I've ever heard of with this bonding ritual. The Tau do a bonding ritual that's kind of similar, but it's like they don't have like synaptic connections and stuff. It's more like a sergeant upgrade thing. Yeah, I have no problem with 60 plus pages of world building just because it's cool. And even if it is exposition, I feel like I could just cut out many of these chapters and just lay it bare for anyone to read, and they would be like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, whoa!" Yeah, I feel like it would be like that. That's at least how I feel. It was not yet dawn cycle, but Barsabbas and Sargol were already in the maze of Acts Marshal. Squad Beshpa had set up a 3-point fire pattern in a little-used section of the maze. The ceiling of the tunnel had collapsed under the bacterial acid, forming a natural cave itself. The collapse had also breached several water filtration pipes, and resolute fluid had allowed a host of microscopic organisms to thrive and grow. Through the thermal imaging of his helmet, the interior wilderness appeared to Barsabbas as a low-lying pattern of fronds, reefs, and fungal caps. He opened the vents of his armor and allowed the moist external air to creep into his suit. Tasting with his tongue, he judged 72% humidity in the air combined with a high blend of toxic carbon, likely released by the nearby floral growth. There was something else in the air, too, the animal scent of sweat or something similar. There was a flash of thermal color to his left. and Barsabbas turned to meet it. His ocular targeting systems already synchronizing with his bolter sides. A human shape rose from behind a mound of viral lichen and opened fire. The first shot went wide, a ranging shot that had left a searing afterimage of its trajectory across Barsabbas' vision. The next one clipped him on the hip, ricocheting with a whine off his ceramite plate. His armor's demon spirit groaned sleepily in protest. Before Barsabbas could return fire, the human was already dead. Sargol had finished him with a clean chest shot. Bond brother Hedaius and Scython shot him repeatedly, tearing him down to constituent fragments. "Cease fire!" called Sergeant Sika, waving down their violent excess. Hedaius and Scython whooped with glee. "That's it, we're done here," added the sergeant's bloodbond, Balshura. 30 kills. That's the last of them. "No," said Sargol, holding up the aspects. "Squad hold. I'm getting a ghost readout on the aspects." A caged pin of 30 guardsmen captives had been released into the maze less than 2 hours ago. They had been a platoon of Mordians, guarding a merchant vessel en route to Cadia. The men had put up a stoic fight, but by Service's count, they had killed all 30. There shouldn't be any more targets within this section of the maze. Yet their auspex was still pinging. Barsabbas took the auspex from Sargol and studied the tracking device. Whatever it was, the target was large and moved with expert stealth. Several times it moved so quickly that the auspex sonar reflection lost track of its movement. It closed in, only to disappear, then reappear, slightly closer than before. "A maul mouth?" Sargol suggested. He was referring to the apex predator that had evolved in the confines of the Cauldron Born. Barsabbas shook his head. Maw-mouths were light-framed creatures, their slender, hairless bodies suited to hiding within the circulation vents and underneath walkways. This was too big. Abruptly, the auspex began to ping again. 50 meters! Sergeant Sika hissed urgently. As quickly as the warning came, the auspex settled again. The squad fell into interlocking arcs of fire. They couldn't see any targets, except for the bubble of a dimorphic yeast fungus. As it corroded the tunnel walls, there was no sound. 36 meters! Sargol boxed to the squad as his auspex caught a fleeting glimpse. The target was moving fast, darting between the auspex's blind spots. 18 meters! Barsabbas toggled between thermal imaging and negative illumination. Neither showed a target. He loosened the muscles of his shoulders and placed one hand on the boarding axe sheathed against the small of his back. "I've lost the target!" Sika boxed, his voice laced with frustration. Without clearance, Hedaius and Scython loosed a quick burst from their bolters, the distinct echo of the jackhammer shots signaling that they had hit nothing. "Cease your fire, you soft backs!" Sika barked. Suddenly, Scython was flying backwards, as if struck heavily. Hedaius lumbered to the aid of his blood bond, but he too was sent sprawling. It was happening so fast, Barsabbas cursed as he tore the hand axe from its casing and moved small circles to warm up his wrist. Sergeant Sika aimed his bolter at a large dark shape that was quickly in the middle of their position. Sargol did the same while Balshura took the squad flamer to bear. The shape was black, its negative luminescence making it appear colder than its thermal surroundings. "Hold your weapons, Squad Beshba," came a familiar voice through the squad's direct link. Sika lowered his weapon hesitantly. "Captain?" "Aye, Sergeant." Spitting in relief, Barsabbas switched off his thermal imaging. It was dark, and he blinked several times, rapidly dilating his pupils to the increase in visual acuity. The formless black shape immediately became that of Captain Argol. Even in the low light, he was unmistakable. Horn plates cauliflowered up his neck and the left side of his face, sprouting, branching, and multiplying like saltwater coral. Argol was immensely proud of his gifts and seldom wore a helmet to hide them. "You caught us," Sika admitted. As if on cue, Hedaius and Scython staggered back to their feet, their earlier bravado neutralized by the ease of their dispatching. "Learn to adapt quickly. Never become comfortable with one kind of enemy," said Argol. Barsabbas knew their captain was right. Space Marine armor was an insulated exterior of ceramite and adamantium, almost invisible to thermal or heat detection. Had they relied on their own hypersensitive vision, perhaps they would have spotted their attacker. That's what makes us dangerous. We are the symbiosis of war machine and human ability, Argos continued. Do not rely on gears and motors. Remember, you have two hands and a brain. Sika unlocked his helmet to reveal a face of heavy cheekbones and long, matted coils of hair. His heavy brow ridge was pinched in a grimace. The sergeant did not like being made a fool of, even by the venerable captain. You didn't come all this way to lecture us on battle theory, my captain. What do you need from us? Sergeant Sika, your squad performance was less than notable on Govina. There. The mere mention of it made Barsabbas wince inwardly. He knew Sargo would feel the shame. What of it? Sika snarled. I know you fought hard. Post-operation data showed picked evidence of heavy Tau casualties. Have you had the pleasure of viewing the aerial surveillance? There is a pit capture of a rock ridge lined with Tau bodies and a neat little battle line. All of them. Gunned down in a straight line, just like that. Pop, pop, pop. Sika was not amused. We faced almost 500 Tau foot soldiers. They are pliable and break open easily, but their guns are difficult to trade shots with. Even their basic infantry rifle cuts through a clear 30 centimeters of brick. The fact remains, you were defeated, beaten, driven back. It's brought shame to your squad and, by extension, my company. Barsabbas and Balshora hiss, as if warming up the Betcher's gland beneath his tongue. For the first time in 10 months, Squad Beshpa had become pariahs within the chapter. What do you need from us? Sika repeated wearily. I'm giving you a chance to redeem your performance. 5 squads from Captain Hazret's first company will be deploying to Hauts Bassiq. Sapta and Moore have for once agreed to this course of action. Barsabbas kept quiet, but his breathing quickened with quick anticipation. Although it was left unsaid, there was no doubt Captain Angle had requested their presence on this mission. It meant the company, despite their misgivings, still believed Squad Beshpa was effective and a dependable squad. But they would need to act to redeem that reputation. This is your chance. I have petitioned Captain Hazreth to augment his forces with Squad Beshpa. Hazreth has accepted. Argo finished. Beside Barsabbas, Sargo slapped his palms in anticipation. A hush fell over the squad. Second Company's honor is at stake here, Sergeant Sika. There existed a long and violent history when I inherited this company. A reputation for being monsters and fables. Bastion, Cadia, Armageddon, the Medina Corridor. The actions at Toonfall. I hope these wars mean as much to you as they do to me. But Second Company have never found wanting. Good, noble men fear us. Soldiers of alien cultures know us by name and know of our brutality. We make their warrior caste feel inferior. They all nodded. I won't pressure you, Sergeant Sika, but you must know Squad Beshpa carries our history on their shoulders. It's easy. Well, I mean, there are many Chaos Space Marines that are just bullies with no culture. They're just guys with huge guns. That push their bulk around and cause mayhem. That's the Blood Gorgons. That is the Blood Gorgons. They clearly do not care about the Long War. Everything I've read so far, they just care about themselves. They're just space pirates, bullies. But even then, because I could see these guys as the bad guys in another book. In fact, I think they are the bad guys in another book. I think they are the bad guys in this book. But even then, when you kill one of them, it's a big deal. They have a whole motivation. They have a whole bond. They have all sorts of stuff going on. When you kill one of them, it's you're not just You're not just ending a video game henchman's life. You're killing a legacy, and then that's what they're talking about right now. Okay, you can't. They don't like to lose. They like to win. They have motivations. They have inspirations, and they will differ by squad. So what I'm saying is when you end one, you end an entire legacy. The Blood Gorgons were deploying. Despite the nature of a scouting deployment, the entire Cauldron Born was thrumming with activity. Mor's coven was coaxing the warp drives and demon spirits. Alarm sirens were blaring. Engine slaves were sweating. There was no rest, no pause in labor. Freight docks were ramped, shrines were tended to. And everywhere was the synchronized stomp of boots and black turban patrols. Weaponsmith Linus knew he would not be sleeping for several rotations. The deploying squads had equipment that needed to be repaired and readied for war, and already his apprentices were bowed in focused work. Acletus had stooped at her workbench, a portly woman in her 50s who had once been a respected doll maker in the home hive of Delphina. Her hands worked quickly, darting between whetstone file and a trader marine's cutlass. On their benches, others were hammering the dents out of water canisters, remeshing buckle straps, or cleaning trophy racks. These were not the sacred power armors or bolters of the Blood Gorgons, for no slaves were allowed to touch those, much less be entrusted with them, such artifacts. Rather, these were the various tools of the traitor marines. The slaves worked by the light of the small gas lamp and candle flame. It was slow, agonizing work, but it was better than being a menial. Although their work chamber was a dark box in the ship's dilapidated lower halls, they were allowed to sleep under their own workbenches after rotation and were rationed 1.5 standard meals per day. The walls were covered with old sheets and shredded waste to insulate against the sub-zero space climate. Though an ever-present haze, tobacco smoke was chain-lit to help them through their work shifts. Despite these conditions, the mending slaves had come to accept the cubic little chamber as their home. They had learned to make the best of what had become to them, and even their portion of the ship, as the smokehouse. An entire half of the smokehouse was cramped with racks of axes, boarding pikes, and gaudy blades that had been delivered there since the morning cycle. Varied were the weapons in the collection, as no two traitor marines possessed the same arsenal. These were personal caches, collected by each individual over decades or centuries of service, a veritable history of their achievements. Each Blood Gorgon took great pride in their exotic collections, and any fleck of dust or slight damage would cost the weaponsmith one finger. Already, Linus, meticulous with his work as he was, had lost one little finger and a ring finger, once for sharpening an axe blade against the grain, and another for leaving carbon buildup on the pommel of a sword that he could not reach with his tools. There is a boarding axe which needs sharpening and rebinding, a young apprentice told Linus. Would you like me to finish it, boss? Linus shook his head. The apprentice was a mere boy. In the time he would learn the finer points of regraining and weave binding. But for now, he was too clumsy to be entrusted with such a dangerous task. Not now, lad, replied Linus. Squad Brigand needs 100 leather pouches to be oiled. You get along with that. Picking up the short-handled axe, he ran a palm against its length. Although the slaves were told nothing about the nature of the deployment, Linus had been enslaved long enough that he could judge by the tools of the traitor marines which nature the mission would be. This time, there was a predominance of light and concealable weapons. The absence of heavier weaponry, such as halberds or polearms, suggested it would be no quick frontal assault. There was no preponderance of boarding pikes to be retoothed, as there often would be before a boarding raid. Lighter weapons meant utility. Perhaps a long distance campaign, a planet of smoldering fields and ash plains. Linus remembered distant fields, exotic plant life, and fauna. He remembered, when he was younger, the fields outside his hab that had been covered in green grass and the swaying growth of trees. But try as he might, he could not remember what they smelled like or how they felt to touch. He knew only the cauldron born, now and nothing else. Linus sighed. He often wondered where these traded marines went, even if they were horrifying war zones. Surely anything would be better than a lifetime of enslavement, subsidizing on gruel and watery yogurt. Barsabbas and Sargol summoned their retinue sometime around mid-cycle. Situated in the Cauldron Boar's middle decks, the Blood Gorgons' interior citadels rose against the cliffs and numberless ramparts of the ship's interior. Turreted proto-fortresses loomed along the dark rises and shelves of the superstructure, each one housing one pair of bonded brethren. Lighting their way with lamps, the personal slaves went quickly and urgently, together in a hurried flock. There were 200 black turbans in their brass armor, Ashar and Dow striding imperiously in their upturned and pointed boots. The helm bearers came next, little more than young boys, in stiffly embroidered tabards. A trail of munitions and ornament servitors clattered behind, guarded by a trio of scale hounds. Behind them, appearing unrushed, came the litter of pleasure pets, collected from a double dozen planets, each of the women chosen on 9 Slaneshi principles of exotic beauty. The fortresses remained unconnected. The chain link walkways that had connected them had been destroyed centuries ago and never rebuilt. The Blood Gorgons had not always been a unified chapter before the reign of Gamadin. During the early stages of their excommunication, intra-chapter conflict had reduced them to little more than a band of thieves escaping together for survival. It had been a time of turmoil during which the Blood Gorgons had turned upon one another and walled themselves up within their drifting fortress. Even after Gamadin united the chapter, after the reforging, the citadels remained a memorial for their past failings. The retinue of Barsabbas and Sargol arrived at a grated walkway. Behind them, spanning an abyssal drop, the walkway led towards blast shutters, set in a wall. They dropped away like a cliff edge. Swathes of rust honeycombed the citadel cast across the pit. Fat and imposing, it swept 400 meters down into the shadows and dim pinpricks of strobing light. And so that's like another thing, I guess, is it took me way too long to realize this, and I say it quite often, but the Imperium has one unifying factor, which is the Emperor. Okay, the Imperium has the Emperor. Chaos has no such thing. There is no such singular unifying force. You could maybe just say the forces of chaos existed in the Horus Heresy, but even then, freaking the Emperor's children weren't truly allied with Horus. They just used the assault on Terra as the siege of Terra as an excuse to ransack and kill and maim. So and in within that vacuum, there is another culture, and yeah, there has to be a culture in the vacuum. I mean, the only time I've ever seen like culture as Chaos Space Marines are those things that Han Sao makes, the Moncubla things that are just like children with guns. Those are cultureless Chaos Space Marines, but these are something different. These they have a culture. They've cultured. Barsabbas sighed wearily. First, he and Sergeant Sargol forswore their oaths of brotherhood. The Astartes implant, known as the Amaphaga, allowed for learning by eating. Through the implant, they were able to read or observe genetic information that they had consumed. The omphega, transmitting the gained information to the brain, is a set of memories or experiences. The blood Gorgons remembered a time that they had fought against one another. Although they had always been one chapter, the reforging was part of their chapter history. The oaths reminded them of this, or so the veterans said. Barsabbas could not remember the reforging. That was before his time. No more than a curious relic of history. Barsabbas cut a small piece of flesh from inside his cheek, while Sargol sliced open the meat of his right thumb. A tiny sample of blood and flesh was collected into a brass bowl, and the bloody tissue was diluted with alcohol solution. Apparently, the blood was traditionally mixed with fermented mead. These days, honey was a rarity for the chapter and was simply more efficient to manufacture alcoholic solvents. Perhaps Barsabbas would appreciate these rituals if they were not some mere nuisance to be observed for the sake of tradition. He shrugged and slugged down the caustic mixture. The sacrifice of armament followed. Barsabbas and Sargol stripped naked and lowered their bodies into a simmering cauldron. The water was hot, hot enough to parboil the outermost layers of skin. Once bathed, the inflamed skin was then vigorously rubbed with coarse-grained salts. Lastly, a thick white salve of woad, a mixture of animal fat, minerals, and biochemicals, was applied to toughen their skin, numbing it. Again, Barsabbas found the process unnecessary. The skin was more prone to infection in humid combat zones. Yet, they did not argue their procedure. It was something that had always been. Under the skin treatment, the trader marine's suit of power armor was fitted into place, segment by segment. The plugs, stem cords, and synapse wires were connected from armor to black carapace. Fully suited and armored, Barsabbas could not help but notice the subtle reaction from his servants. They shied away from him, afraid to be close. It happened often. It was as if normal humans had an instinctive fear of space marines, a deeply seated biological aversion to being something close to something so dangerous, so powerful. Finally came the sacrifice of smoke. This was the ritual that Barsabbas found the most pragmatic, despite its superstitious nature. While in warp transit, objects were likely to go missing. To a warrior mind, the phenomena was unexplainable and oddly disturbing. Small items left unlocked or unbolted would disappear. Sometimes these would be vital pieces of war gear, or even the firing pin of a bolter. In order to prevent such warp poltergeist activity, most loyalist chapters prayed and erected gargoyles. The Blood Gorgons observed this superstition in their own way, by discharging firecrackers and parading in their war helms. It was the Blood Gorgons' belief that war helms needed to be terrifying enough to scare even the demons of chaos, or ill fortune would be invited. Barsabbas' helmet was terrifying indeed, a screaming bovine sculp with a narrow slitted vision lens and wide antlers like arms rearing up to frighten away mischievous spirits. He danced a strange, spasmodic dance, executing clumsy movements in his power armor. The retinue beat drums and cymbals while singing. With the final sacrifices complete, Barsabbas and Sargol stood in their full finery of war. He stole a look in the gilded mirror. In their chambers, the creature that had looked back at him appeared monstrous, a broad framework of engineered bone and muscle. Theatrical yet pugnacious, his mask was strangely emotionless, its exaggerated scream frozen into the rigor mortis of sculpted brass. He realized he was the most feared fighting unit in the universe. He allowed that thought to settle upon him for a moment. It was intoxicating. They were a mobile fortress, able to bold charge headfirst into a storm of enemy munitions unscathed. They were destructive, the firepower at their immediate disposal able to flatten urban blocks. With his bare hands, gloved in ceramite, he could crush and pry open sheets of metal. maybe even support girders of a building. Master! Cried the slaves, as the ritual preparations drew to a close. They mewed collectively, scratching pleadingly at their faces, as if Barsabbas and Sargol had forgotten. Barsabbas watched Sargol slide a black metal piston from a leather carrier in his thigh plate. The slaves lined up eagerly. One after another, Sargol viced the jaws in his hand, turning their faces ever so slightly upwards. The piston punched their cheek scars with a meaty thud. The slaves would wince, flinching away from Sargol's grasp with a weeping wound in their cheek. They liberated the slaves in turn, extracting the larvae from their flesh. Sargol hurried through the process without veneration, his movements deftly practiced, yet rough and bored. A young girl with a graceful neck was next in line. Barsabbas had never learned her name. She was just a menial. Sargol trapped her timid face between the vice of his fingers. The black tube slid into her cheek, like a monstrous syringe. She remained stoic as it retracted, leaving a neat incision below her cheekbone. A hard tap of the piston dislodged a tiny white larva onto the floor, oozing with fluid and pus. It trembled fitfully upon contact with the air, expanding rapidly, its membranous cocoon stretching and straining. As the egg skin peeled away, a fleshy nub of fingers and teeth emerged. The newly birthed creature resembled an arachnid, with a web of bone-shearing mandibles above its abominable sac. Black hair, coarse and wet, sprouted wildly from its throbbing skin. Sargol set his heel down and crushed the skittering mess. You are all free until our return, Sargol said. The slaves, some amongst them waving their palms against bleeding faces, stared up like a lost herd of particularly dull sheep. Most of them knew of no other life than servitude. Some had been born into slavery, their ancestors having dwelt in the slave warrens for many generations. If we do not return, then you will all die with us. For this is the way the gods will it. You serve only us, and live by the virtue of our existence. Without us, you cannot be allowed to live, Sargol announced. It may not make sense to you, but it is our way. In gleaming cauldrons and platters on carts, the food was served in the hall of solemn supper. Teeming like colony ants, cutlery slaves toiled, the paper of their steps straightened across the ancient floorboards. The hall of solemn supper was a narrow, antiquated chamber deep within the ship's furnished core, with great wooden beaming ceilings dating from a time when the ship was an abandoned drifter. Arched windows framed the sculpted mermaidens and harpies, were spaced evenly, allowing the half-full view of distant stars and galaxies. Here the blood gorgons came to feast before deployment, and was customary, received their pre-mission assembly with the company commander. Although it marked the last stage of squad level planning and tactics, it was also a somber time to gather and feast among brothers. It was only a small deployment, with 5 squads. Many of the long tables arrayed in 100-man company lines were empty, yet the food and wine were nonetheless bountiful. The kitchen crews had been diligent in their preparation of the Trader Marine's pre-war nutrition. Loaves of fiber-dense whole-grain breads steamed in the baskets. Creamed soups from the vessel's fungal colonies were wheeled out in cauldrons. Roast and furnace meats of all kinds were hauled out in hand wagons. The 5 squads sat together at the long table, with Captain Hazreth at their head. Gathered were Squad Beshpa, Squad Hestor, Squad Yugoth, Squad Brigand, and veteran fire team Shark Ali. Barsabbas found himself sitting opposite a brother of Squad Hestor. He gave him a curt nod, nothing more. It was known amongst the company that Squad Hestor were the Murites, supporter of Mur's ascension. Their sergeant, Brother Clodin, was an ambitious aspirant who had hungered for conquest, and that did not sit well with the company. The squads fell into silence as Hazreth pushed back at the granite bench with a scrape. I would not be more confident in the destruction you will cause, Hazreth began. The squad stamped and clapped clamorously, filling wine and bashing basalt tables with their fists. Barsabbas was so caught up in the excitement, he crushed a brass dining plate in his hands and hurled it across the hall. Hazareth motioned for quiet. Our worlds in Hauts Bassiq have signaled for our aid. It is our duty to our slave stock worlds that we answer their calls. So it has always been. He brought up a hololithic display from a vertical projector. This is an aerial surveillance pict from the last time we harvested gene stock. That was close to 16 cycles ago, or almost 80 years standard. As you can see, the terrain is largely open, flat country. The Adeptus Mechanicus blasted the land prior to settlement. In doing so, the ensuing firestorm depleted the atmosphere, causing atmospheric temperatures to scale intolerable for heights within years. Barsabbas took a sip of his wine and realized it could be the last time in months that his hydration levels would be optimal. The furious loss of sweat and Hauts Bassiq's scarcity of water had driven the Imperial colonies away and turned the planet into a ghost desert. Spilling a cartographer's chart over the table and cutlery, Hazareth tapped the map with a blunt, armored fingertip. Of all our 62 recruitment worlds, Hauts Bassiq breeds one of the rarest and hardiest stock, due to its borderline inhospitable climate. Minerally, it is one of the richest resources. Brother Sergeant Cloden frowned and rapped on the table in between mouthfuls of beef tendon. What do we have of what use do we have of mineral resources? We have never been ones to hoard. Sargal interjected tersely. Warp iron, Cloden. Do you not know what warp iron is? He asked coldly. Barsabbas nodded to himself knowingly. Although he was too young to have visited Hauts Bassiq, he had researched the catacombs for archived intelligence. Due to Hauts Bassiq's proximity to Arcalaris Tarabas, its surface was marked with warpstone impacts that had compressed over the ages into a compound similar to uranium. Warp iron was what kept the Cauldron-born's fusion reactors running. Ever since the chapter had claimed the ghost ship as its own, a piece of irradiated warp iron, almost 300 meters in length, had powered the reactor core. Before Cloden could respond, Captain Hazareth pointed the map again. AT threat disposition. Enemy threat disposition is unknown. Xenos? Coation? Sergeant Sika asked. Hazareth shook his head, drained his wine cup before answering. Entirely unknown. The signal beacon from Hauts Bassiq relayed no other information. Try not to retreat if shot at again, Sergeant Cloden snorted. Sargal stood up, clattering dishes and spilling a goblet. His naked blade was drawn. Sergeant Sargal, I will not have blades drawn. Sergeant Sargal, I will not have blades drawn at my table, Captain Hazard shouted, quick to quell the violence. Slaves frightened by the outburst, scurried from the alcoves to refill the wine goblets and placate the warriors with loaded plates of cold meat and spiced offal. The squads fell back to eating, shooting hard glares at each other across the table. Hazareth rotated the hololith and zoomed in close. Your main objective is to reach the city of Or. This is the last bastion of technology on Bassiq. The remaining imperialists have sequestered themselves there in the sealed city. They no longer maintain much contact with the nomads who use as gene stock. If any campaign were to be mounted, it would commence here. There are few other strategic assets among the major continents. The plainsmen dwell in semi-nomadic bands elsewhere. Why have our battle brothers, ancestors, not conquered or already? Why leave an imperial bastion to blight the landscape? Barsabbas asked. Because we choose and pick our fights carefully. There is nothing to be gained from overwhelming the barons of Or. They are an isolationist cult, yet they protect their world from Xenos raids and minor threats when we cannot. They do not even know of our existence or our sovereignty over their lands. Also, Cloden said sneeringly, we would risk too much. Our chapter would have a difficult time overwhelming even that little dirt hole, he said to Barsabbas. They use a fusion reactor, much like our own, The power void shield's thicker than your skull. Captain Hazrith remained impassive, but Barsabbas could sense his Koshin's seething resentment for the Murites. What you may not know, said Captain Hazrith, is that Earth sits on the largest deposit of warp iron on the planet. There's an estimated to be enough warps there to fuel the Cauldron-born fusion reactors